Welcome back to this session where we will have two papers and with two discussants. The first paper, which is Generative AI and Firm-Level Productivity, Evidence from Startup Funding Dynamics, is going to be presented by Dominik Asam from the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition. So, Dominik, floor is yours. You have 30 minutes, and the discussion will be Soto from the Federal Reserve Board. So.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Dominik Asam. I'm a PhD student at the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition in Munich. First of all, thanks a lot for having me. It's been a great first day, and I'm really happy to kick off this first session of the second day. The paper I want to talk to you about today is called Generative AI and Firm-Level Productivity with Evidence from Startup Funding Dynamics, and it's co-authored with David Heller. Our aim with this paper is to provide some new empirical and some theoretical insights. Theoretical here from a management perspective. I'm really sorry to all fellow econ people. There's not going to be any fancy maths here. But we look at the impact of Gen AI on productivity at the firm level. And when we speak about productivity, in this case, we look at startup funding outcomes and employment dynamics. Specifically, we try to answer a few questions. First of all, the baseline. Can Gen AI increase productivity at the firm level for startups? And if so, under which circumstances? Second, what are the complementary assets that are needed for a firm to capture any value from generative AI? And lastly, and this is sort of more the general theoretical angle, how can firms exploit a valuable but non-exclusive technological innovation as a source of competitive advantage? Now, as we have seen and heard throughout these first presentations, there have been some huge expectations out there to what Gen AI can do for productivity. We have heard these bold numbers, for example, this one from Goldman Sachs here, that says Gen AI and its productivity effects could raise global GDP by 7%. Similarly, McKinsey comes up with up to 4.4 trillion in value across industries. And these numbers got quickly picked up by a very popular news outlet. The Financial Times speaks of a new productivity revolution. Forbes says AI shaping the future of prosperity, and Bloomberg, we heard the quote by Bob Solo today already, says that Gen AI could solve the productivity paradox. So a lot of expectations out there, but what do we know actually about what Gen AI does to productivity at the moment? So what's the evidence we have from papers? So first of all, it is true that at the individual level, Gen AI seems to really boost the productivity of individuals. And there are some great experimental papers out there that look at tasks like programming, writing, consulting, customer service, and across the board, we see very significant productivity effects. However, and that we noticed also yesterday over the course of the first presentations, we know very little yet about its impact in these more complex organizational settings. There are some first studies on stock market values and some employment effects, but there's not that much out there. And in fact, there are even first signs of divergent individual versus organizational effects, especially regarding who benefits most from Gen AI. So this is sort of one of the motivations why we think it's really, really important to look at the firm level in this regard too. Then the second part is, if we take this angle from the resource-based view, this is very managerial, but if we do this for a second, it's not really clear what Gen AI does to the individual startup as well. So on the one hand, of course, we could think about Gen AI and these productivity effects at the individual level to help startups explore business ideas more efficiently, to do more experimentation, easier prototyping, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, Gen AI solutions are neither unique nor imperfectly imitable, nor controlled by a specific firm, which, from the angle of the resource-based view, should limit its potential as a source of competitive advantage. Now, how do we want to shed light on this whole setting? We are trying to leverage a quasi-natural experiment where we look at the release of GitHub Copilot as a positive shock to the productivity of software developers. So GitHub Copilot is this coding assistant that helps you write code much more efficiently. And what's cool about this is that we can use the cross-sectional variation that comes from this, as not every startup should be affected equally by this new technology. And essentially what we do here is we compare software developing startups to other software and non-software startups. Important part, how do we measure productivity? So what we do is look primarily at funding dynamics, and most of all at the time it takes startups from incorporation to raising their initial or second and third funding round. And at the same time, we look at the employee inputs, at the employee counts that these startups use to achieve these funding outcomes. As a second step, we also look at differences in founding team characteristics, especially technological and entrepreneurial experience, to look at the role of human resources as a complementary asset to generative AI. Upfront, what do we find? So first of all, we see software developing startups secure their initial funding 20% faster after the release of GitHub Copilot and relative to our control groups, while deal sizes remain stable. And importantly, they achieve these funding outcomes with about 22% fewer software developers. And lastly, if we look at the heterogeneity, effects are driven by startups whose founders have more technological experience, such as a computer science degree, and more entrepreneurial experience, such as serial founders. And this we interpret in a way that we say bundling Gen AI with complementary human capital can actually provide startups a source of competitive advantage. Let's take a look at what's going on under the hood here, starting off with the data we use. So we have two main data sources. The first one is Crunchbase. There we get data on startup, investor, and funding characteristics. Most importantly, all the information on funding rounds. And second, we use Revalue, which uses large-scale LinkedIn data for getting highly granular employee-level data and their characteristics and employment histories. With this, we can sort of track the employee composition of startups, of our sample startups, over time. In the end, we arrive with startups that have raised an initial funding round between the first quarter of 2020 and the third quarter of 2023. And they are from all sectors and headquartered in the US, Canada, or Europe. Our final sample includes, after some final cleaning steps, 22,000 startups, about 42,000 investment rounds, and around 225,000 employees. One more word on how exactly we think about productivity in this setting. So one has to keep in mind that in these very early stages of startups, it's incredibly hard to get information about them because essentially every information is private and not directly shared structurally. So funding rounds provide really some of the first observable data points that we can use for all sorts of empirical analysis. And as I said, we are primarily looking at how long it takes startups from the date of incorporation to the first funding. And then later on, we also look at other funding rounds. And from our understanding, this time to funding measure captures how quickly startups achieve certain milestones, certain requirements for raising these funding rounds. You could think about you need to probably develop a prototype. You might need to acquire first customers to convince investors to fund your startup. So an acceleration in this time to funding can, from our view, reflect a productivity increase at the startup level. A few more words about the empirical setting about GitHub Copilot. So as I briefly mentioned, GitHub Copilot is this coding assistant. It's developed by OpenAI and GitHub. And what it essentially does is it completes single lines of code while you write them. It can create whole new blocks of code and debug code to help you finding errors and so on. And there's two important things about this. First of all, we see that it got adopted really, really quickly. So already in 2023, the share of code generated by GitHub Copilot ranged between 46 and 61% in popular coding languages, such as Python. And the second point, which is important, is that we have already experimental evidence on the individual productivity effects of GitHub Copilot. And these are already also pretty substantial. So In this one experiment, they found a reduction of 56% in time to completion. That's what they measured for certain software development tasks at the individual level. What makes this a great setting in our view is the timeliness. What you can see here, I hope it's big enough, is some Google search trends. In blue, you can see the Google search trends for GitHub Copilot, in red for generative AI, and the dotted green line is the search interest for ChatGPT, which only spikes at the very end. So what you can see here is that the launch, so this whole rollout of GitHub Copilot is largely unaffected from all other general trends around generative AI, which were mostly triggered by the release of ChatGPT. So we are sort of in front of the hype in our time period. And the other thing that I mentioned in the beginning is that unlike tools like ChatGPT, GitHub Copilot was developed for one specific target group, which is software developers. So we think that it has very varying effects on different types of startups. And what we do here is we use this to define our treatment and control groups in this natural experimental setting. Our treatment group is software developing startups. That's what we call them. What you can think about here is really where creating new software is at the core of the product or service that you're offering. So for example, a software as a service startup that builds whole new software for a given business process and sells the software to their customers. Now, other startups include examples like e-commerce startups. They're still considered software startups, but today you might not even have to write a single line of code to build an e-commerce startup, because you can use a lot of no-code or low-code tools and so on. And then the last group is very obvious. We also include all non-software startups in our analysis. With this at hand, we can already draw some first descriptive statistics. What you can see here are cumulative hazard rates for the time to funding of software developing startups versus all the other startups. In panel A, before the release of GitHub Copilot, and on the right side in panel B, after the release of GitHub Copilot. Now, as you can see in panel A, these patterns are very closely aligned with, for example, after 4 quarters, about 35% of both groups having raised their initial funding. But afterwards, we see this clear divergence in these hazard rates, where software developing startups, a larger share of software developing startups raised their funding more quickly compared to these other startups. Similarly, we can look at these trends over time. And we look here at two important dates. The orange one is the technical release. This is the first time that GitHub Copilot got available to a broad audience of software developers. And then the public release as a second date. And as you can see here, we have very closely aligned trends before the release for these two groups. And then we see this clear diverge with software developing startups eventually reducing their time to funding. Now, this is all descriptive, of course. So let's look at how we actually try to estimate the effect. So what we do is we employ a very basic difference in differences analysis. And we do so by looking at the impact of Copilot as a differential effect on the time to funding of these startups, comparing software developing and the other startups. So we have this classic interaction term here with the coefficient that is most interesting to us. Then we include some controls at the firm and at the investor level. And importantly, we also include fixed effects to account for time, country, and industry-specific factors. Having a look at the baseline results. So we can just focus on column 1 here, which is sort of the basic setup. So what you can see here is if we employ this estimation, we can directly interpret these coefficients in months, by the way. We see that software developing startups, after the release of Copilot and relative to the control group, decreases their time to funding by about 4.8 months. So this is not only statistically significant, but as I said at the beginning, this is about a 20% decrease in time to funding. So also economically for these startups, that's supposedly very, very meaningful. And this effect holds across several specifications. For example, if we compare only within software startups. Now, we do a lot in the paper to challenge the robustness of these results. We do all the basic stuff, so to say, with different treatment definitions. We only looked at specific investment types, such as only seed funding, and run some placebo tests. And importantly, we also look at several other events that could explain some of the effect that we're seeing here. We, for example, look at the COVID-19 and the switch towards remote work, since this could be easier for software startups than for other startups. We look at the overall VC market sentiment and the investment climate during our time period. And importantly, we also look at ChatGPT, since our time period overlaps a bit in the end with the release of ChatGPT. And we do a lot to show that it is not only a hype effect driven by more new software developing startups being created or by investors jumping on AI startups, for example. So even if we exclude all quarters after the ChatGPT release, our results qualitatively don't change. The estimations get a bit smaller, but we still see a very significant pattern there. So I will not show you all the tables for this, but happy to discuss later on. What we do as a next exercise is we also look at deal sizes, which is important. And the main takeaway here from this table is that there's not much happening. So apparently deal sizes seem to remain pretty stable. And this points really towards the idea that startups are apparently at a similar maturity at an earlier point in time, as they receive the similar amounts of funding from the investors. Another thing we do is we look at the second and third funding round for a subsample of our startups. And here we see a nice pattern where in the second funding round, so the time to second funding, the effect decreases a bit, but we still see significant effects. And then for the third funding round, the effect completely diminishes. So this points towards an idea where these Gen AI tools, and in our setting specifically GitHub Copilot, are most useful to startups in the earliest stages, when really their resource constraints are highest, when they do a lot of experimentation, they try to build their core value proposition, so to say. That's when Gen AI seems to be most helpful. As a next step, we of course need to talk about employment, as this is also a big debate on what this does to firms using generative AI. We heard a lot about this yesterday already, and of course there are tons of anecdotes out there regarding this. I picked a few here. One is a LinkedIn post from a serial founder here. He heard that of a founder who laid off 2 junior engineers, in this case software developers, and does all of the coding himself now. And apparently for this startup, product development is much faster now, with the founder alone doing the job, so to say. Similarly, the Wall Street Journal reports that computer science graduates find it really hard to find jobs after they graduate, even if they come from top schools. So something that was basically unthinkable a few years ago. And also, this is just aggregate statistics and just very descriptive, but also aggregate statistics, in this case, job postings from the hiring platform Indeed show that in the middle of 2022, there seems really to be happening something with the demand for software developers compared to all other jobs on the platform. So in our setting, this raises 2 questions. First of all, does the release of GitHub Copilot reduce the demand for software developers in our sample startups? And what is the role of experience in this setting? So do experienced founders get better? Do they profit more? And so on. So what we do first is, this is again purely descriptive. We look at the number of employed software developers at the time of funding for our sample startups. One nice thing is, this is just a pre-Copilot period. This sort of validates our treatment classification, since non-software startups employ on average a bit less than 1 software developer, other startups about 2, and our treatment group software developing startups employ on average a bit more than 3 software developers at the time of funding before Copilot. If we look at these same numbers after the release of Copilot, we see this clear drop in the average number of software developers at our treatment group, at the software developing startups, while for the other 2 groups, nothing much changes. Now, this is still descriptive. If we plug this in as a new dependent variable in the same difference in differences estimation, we can again look at the first column at the coefficient. We see that on average, software developing startups employ about 0.5, so half a software developer less after the release of GitHub Copilot and compared to the control groups. And this is only within software startups. Yeah, and we see this as well holds across several specifications here. So I think one important takeaway here is already that apparently in our setting, these startups raise the same amount of funding, but in a shorter amount of time and with fewer software developers. Now, as a last thing, we are looking at differences across founding teams. And specifically, we try to look at what role experience plays in this setting. What we do here is we run some split sample regressions for our treated startups. And we have several measures for some form of experience. So for example, in the first two columns, we look at computer science degrees and if anybody from the founding team has a computer science degree. And as we can see by the coefficient in the first column, the effect is about triple the size, even a bit more, for founding teams with a computer science degree compared to those without. Similarly, we can look at founder age at a Crunchbase rank, which is an internal ranking of the popularity of founders on this database. And lastly, this is what I want to highlight again, we can look at serial founders, so people who have founded a business before and their startup is now, their second startup or third startup is now in a sample. Here we also see that the coefficient is about twice the size for startups with a serial founder compared to those without. So what we conclude from this is that our main effects seem to be really driven by the more experienced founding teams by these startups. And apparently the integration of Gen AI, at least to some degree, depends on the capabilities of these managers, of these entrepreneurs. What are the implications of this? And please keep in mind theory, human management. So at the outset, we asked, can new generally available technologies, despite being non-rare and imitable, still provide a source of competitive advantage? And our results show that despite lacking these typical characteristics for assets that should provide a competitive advantage, Gen AI significantly impacts these funding dynamics across startups. And from this last exercise we did, we see the complementarities between the founder's human capital, so in this case, the educational background and their work experience, and the nature of the new technology. So in this case, this coding assistant, this Gen AI coding assistant, ultimately determine its firm-specific value. So if you provide the relevant human capital, you can leverage these new tools very effectively. So we conclude more generally that valuable but non-exclusive technological innovation can provide a source of competitive advantage if firms leverage them as complementary assets to their existing skill sets. So what should we take away from this? First of all, we hope to show that Gen AI is indeed capable of increasing productivity at the firm level. Second, these effects are most pronounced for startups in their earliest stages when their resource constraints are most binding. And third, productivity effects are ultimately determined by founders' technological and entrepreneurial experience. With this a bit ahead of time, I thank you very much, and I'm really, really looking forward to hear what you think of it. Thanks.
Thank you so much for excellent presentation. I'm very interested myself in the VC research, so I will be, let's say, a little bit questioning you on some of the method in VC data, let's say, analysis. So first of all, I was wondering why you labeled your research as a productivity research. Basically, you are looking at very young, early stage startups, which still have probably several years until the exit. So in a way, you're looking just at how attractive they are to the investors rather than how productive they are. So usually we measure outcomes through the exit, right, or raising higher rounds and so on. So in a way, I was wondering about that. And second as well, also have an experience working with VC data during the COVID. There is so much, as everyone says, there's so much going on. So there was the increase in the VC capital availability. There was hype around the software startups. Everyone got excited about remote work. And then during the COVID and after COVID, it continued. So the software startups experienced a lot of attention. As well, the fundraising for the startups became faster, for software startups especially, because now VCs didn't need to look into them personally. There was no in-person meetings. We saw in our results that they are investing very far away now, so they are not even meeting those founders. They're just having a Zoom call and investing. So, and interviews with VCs, they told us that the fundraising basically went from 1 month to several days. So in a way, because they didn't need to travel anymore, they're actually giving money faster. So that kind of also in line with your results. And the last point is that around the same period, there were also layoffs, even from the big companies of the software developers, potentially also outsourcing the jobs to other low-income countries and so on. So this is also something that is in your results. I'm sure you are doing some analysis on that, but I was just wondering if you can still do more in order to try to alleviate those confounding factors. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's pick up another question here. Raymond, please identify yourselves.
Thanks. Ray Lydon, Central Bank of Ireland. A really cool paper, Dominik. I found myself thinking, God, there's got to be confounding factors here. But Paul's discussion was really convincing, so very good. Minor point, the Indeed chart you use, you don't need it, and there's a lot going on. So there was a lot of hiring, maybe some over-hiring that led to that collapse afterwards. There was also tons of churn in this market. So I work a lot with the Indeed data, and those software developers and software engineers, very little firm-specific human capital, so tons of churn. So this is why you had a lot, and then it collapses, I think. But maybe people who work in the industry might be able to talk about that a bit more. The other thing is, in the Indeed data, they might be able to help you if you want to dig into it. So GitHub Copilot is often a requirement in the job ad, so you might dig into that itself around the timing of releases. Could be a whole other paper, but it'd be interesting.
Thanks.
Thank you. You may want to address these two questions, and then we pick up a few more.
Good. These are some very, very good points. I'll start with the first one with the productivity. Actually, my co-author and me, we are heavily discussing this already, whether we should drop the productivity term and just speak of funding dynamics, startup growth, acceleration, whatever, but just drop the term. I think it's a fair point. What we really think is that we hoped with these employment data, we show that there seems to be really something going on at the operational side of the startup. I think we have to do a better job looking at the supply side, as you said, of venture capitalists demanding. So they're themselves wanting to invest more in these startups. On these several things you mentioned, I think regarding COVID, you're absolutely right that a lot changed there, and we really looked a lot into the stuff. So we created a whole new index on how likely you are, for example, to offer remote work as a startup. And I would love to show you all the on the tables and so on. But that apparently, at least from the statistics that we see, that did not seem to have driven our effects. And I think here it's really important that we also compare within software startups. So from my understanding, you have very similar funding dynamics if you compare software within software, so to say. But I totally agree that non-software startups, like hardware startups also, they might have a much harder time raising funding more quickly, for example, due to factors related to remote work and that VCs don't need to travel anymore. But in general, I think you're totally right that we have to dig a bit more, like a bit deeper into the supply side of all of this, of the venture capitalists. With the hype effect, I would love to show you a graph, we can talk later, where we simply look at, we have two graphs, the number of startups that are founded over time and at the share of funding rounds of software developing startups and specifically AI startups and everything changes after ChatGPT, but nothing much changes before that. So I think there's no doubt in saying that, especially in the last few quarters, some of the stuff we see is driven by ChatGPT and by all these different factors. Before that, I hope we do a pretty decent job at identifying the main effect. But I'm very happy to talk to you afterwards for some more recommendations. It was really helpful already. Thank you very much for the insights on that. We actually also don't include the indeed graph anymore in the current version of the paper. I think it's supposed to serve more as a general anecdote that for software development, a lot is changing now, and I'm sure there's a lot at the industry level, just generally. But this is just anecdotal, but I'm pretty sure Gen AI does a lot to the job of software developers and maybe also to their demand, but that's not any claim we're making. So we're just trying to motivate the reason why we're looking into these dynamics. But it was a very good hint with all the other stuff that's going on.
Good. We have time for an extra round of questions. August. Yeah. One here, and the lady in the second row.
Thank you, Christina Gartmann from Leiser in Luxembourg. So I think you already hinted maybe at part of the answer to my question. So I'm wondering how the market for startups changes. I mean, in some sense, you're looking at GitHub Copilot, which will reduce costs because it will substitute some of the developers. So for me, the question would be, well, how does that change the attractiveness of even doing a startup in that field? Or maybe you want to change your startup part, you combine it with something else, maybe another complex product. So do you see anything along that? And I think even if you don't see anything, it would be interesting to include that because you're kind of making your analysis conditional that they're startups. But I mean, obviously there's going to be on the extensive margin also an impact. Thank you.
Another question over there. You may want to react to the comments of Paul later on.
Good morning. Yeah. Agostino Consolo from DCB. Thank you very much, Dominik. Very nice paper. I like to think in terms of automation of codes. In this respect, I would like to frame it in the impact of automation for productivity and employment. And I was curious indeed that you really get at the beginning a big displacement effect. And I was wondering whether you also monitor employment effects also over time, like in the subsequent funding round. So you look at time to funding in the first, second, and third funding round. And I wonder whether after you get the productivity effect immediately somehow in the first round, whether the firms grow in terms of employment or not. That would be interesting to monitor. Thank you.
Thanks.
Very good. Dominik?
Yeah. I'll answer the second question first. It's actually a very good idea. We don't do that yet, but it should be a very easy exercise to look at subsequent funding rounds and the employment effects there. Unfortunately, right now I can't tell you what's happening, but very good idea. We should probably do that. The first question was also really good, and actually I would love to look into this in more detail on what type of startups are being founded now, maybe even after the release of ChatGPT and so on. I think it's going to be a bit hard to find an empirical setting where this is possible. But from anecdotes, I think that especially over the last 2 years, the types of startups, especially software startups being founded, definitely changed to some degree. So there's this famous quote by Sam Altman saying that in a few years there's going to be a one-person, $1 billion startup, because basically you can offer a lot of value with very limited input from the employee side. So I think especially these, we heard this term also, AI native startups, they're incredibly efficient in what they need to create new products and services that are apparently valuable to their customers. So we see startups having 17 million euros of annual recurring revenue, for example, Lovable in Sweden, in 3 months. This was completely insane if you think about it. And these are 15 people. So especially, I think in the last year, there have been some anecdotes that these AI native startups are really, really changing in their characteristics. I'm not sure if this applies to all other startups as well, but yeah.
Very good. Do you want to react to any of the points raised by Paul?
I think it was a very, very nice discussion. Thanks for that. I think especially your idea with the anthropic data is amazing. I definitely want to talk to you about that. But I think we can do that over coffee later. So thanks a lot.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. So let's move to the second paper of the session, which is going to be presented by Manuel Hoffmann from Harvard Business School. And the paper is Generative AI and the Nature of Work. So, Manuel, please, the floor is yours.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me and for your time. Yeah. So this is joint work together with Sam Boysel and Frank Nagle, also both from Harvard Business School, as well as Sida Peng from Microsoft and Kevin Chu from GitHub. Yeah, so I'm glad really to have heard already an introduction to GitHub, so you already know a little bit about it. And yeah, so here what we are trying to do is we really want to think a little bit about, I guess, the future of work, if you like, in a sense of what happens when generative AI comes in natural experiment as well. And in particular, we want to ask, how does AI change the nature of work instead of focusing on productivity? So we are building on the whole productivity literature, if you like. And a little bit more narrowly, we look into how AI changes the task allocation for open source software production. So open source software, if it hasn't been mentioned before, that's basically software that is publicly available under some permissive license, and you can just usually use it, and a lot of companies do use it. So it's highly valuable, which we also show in another paper. But yeah, so we basically look at the weekly activity. We could do this more granularly. We look at the weekly activity for 2 years of open source software developers or maintainers. So those are particular developers that are maintaining a part of a project or software. And our natural experiment is going to be a discontinuity in GitHub's Copilot program to offer GenAI to top maintainers, to some and not others. So just to give you the brief takeaway here, when you get access to GenAI, what happens, software like coding GenAI, core work is increasing, and the project management, relative share of project management is dropping. We find very consistent with some of the literature that the impact is stronger for those with lower ability. We have 2 primary drivers. One is that independent work increases, collaborative work drops, and people experiment a little bit more. All right, so you have seen already previously a bunch of the literature. There's much more that I probably am missing here. But the basic idea is that we've seen for GenAI that it's, we've seen the productivity effects. We also seen for GitHub Copilot in particular, some at minimum 1 experimental study on productivity. So we think this is well established. So now we are going to go beyond that, try to look at the nature of work. We also look at GenAI and its impact on the private provision of a public good, which is open source software. We have long-term, relatively long-term causal evidence from coding GenAI in a real-world scenario. So now, how do we think about work in this kind of setting? Well, we like to think about work in the information economy, broadly speaking, as an individual engaging in core work, or kind of management work. Think about maybe an assistant professor who just got tenure and researches the core work for which he got tenure, or she, and now project management suddenly becomes so much more important after getting tenure. So this maybe the preference is more the core work relative to the managerial work. And this is kind of the same idea that is underlying the preference of developers. So developers' core work is arguably developing, coding, and they're doing a bunch of other things as well, which we call project management, which is really dealing with issues, troubleshooting, things that were mentioned also in the discussion, and interacting with others, assigning them to work. And what they say is, well, we do too little of our core work and too much of this kind of project management stuff based on some free open source software contributor surveys from my colleague Frank Nagle. So we ask, well, how does artificial intelligence come into play here? Could it potentially realign actual work with desired work? And what's the impact of AI on the nature of work? And then what are the potential mechanisms? Now, this is very brief, just to give you, I guess, a little bit of a thought process and how we think about our hypotheses. But the basic idea is, if you think about individuals maximizing utility, and they either engage in core work or managerial work with a kind of budget constraint. Here we have a CS utility function. The basic idea is generative AI reduces the cost of core work here. And that's a shock, also consistent with some of the literature. And well, first hypothesis that it increases when we reduce the cost of something, that may increase the engagement in this particular realm. So IT reduces the cost of task, and workers do more of it. Now, for project management, that's a little bit more ambiguous, because management is not a routine task, so automation may not impact it always in the same way. Now, we basically extend this CS utility model and look into two types of core and managerial instead of one, and look into independent collaborative work, and also experimental and exploitative work, or exploitation, if you like. And the basic idea is tech streamlines communication and decision making and reduces collaboration here, collaboration overhead. So it reduces friction, and it frees workers to focus on their own work in isolation. So independent work goes up, collaborative work goes down for both core work and for kind of managerial work. Similarly, for exploration and exploitation, you can think of the cost of experimentation going down when Gen AI comes into play, and then individuals and organizations tend to shift focus towards those activities. You also have more rapid-fire feedback that you can get when IT investment is automating routine tasks, and that can again promote experimentation. Now, finally, we expected, based on our model, the lower ability individuals to benefit here a little bit more. One intuition could be also that, well, what's happening with Gen AI? It's trained on a bunch of data, bunch of code, and that code usually comes from high ability individuals, and so there could be some transfer of knowledge going on to those low ability individuals, and so from that perspective, one may expect them to benefit more. So the basic problem is we need to identify a setting where we can observe work, and we have an AI tool that's observable, and in our setting, we have GitHub Copilot for key developers in open source software development. Now, to give you a little bit more of an idea about what open source software is, or what people do in this space, so individuals just write a piece of code, and then they upload it to an open source project or repository. So now you become a maintainer of that project, and now you can add or edit code to that project directly, and you can ask other individuals. Other individuals can report issues. They can provide suggestions for code, and you as a maintainer can address those problems or not, and you can accept the code from others as well, and you can assign other individuals. You can also add additional maintainers that are working with you jointly. All right, so this is just a little bit of an idea of what kind of environment we are in. This is all modern digital infrastructure, this huge machinery, and a project that some random person in Nebraska has been thanklessly maintaining since 2003. So you see this little piece there, right? Takes that out, and suddenly our whole machinery may collapse. And this is not just a joke. There are, there's a lot of evidence that this may happen every once in a while. But the main idea is that those individuals that are working on those projects that we're focusing on, they are critical individuals. They're already a little bit more at the higher ability spectrum, I would say. Now, GitHub is, we're looking at the platform GitHub, and it's a de facto hub for collaborative open source software development. Since 2013, the latest, it has gained a substantial momentum, and it allows, importantly, for the private provision of public good, of open source software, and also critically here, we can observe task allocation of coding and project management. And we have this Gen AI tool to address our questions of interest. So now I want to show you a little bit more about this environment and the natural experiment. All right, so I don't know how easily visible that is, but the basic idea here is this is a project, a repository, and you can see a bunch of folders there. And those folders you would see as a developer, and if you're a maintainer, you may have likely created some of those. How did you do that? Well, to go into terminology here, you would engage in some commits. So you would upload code to the platform, and you can really trace when people are engaging in those commits, when they're uploading code to the platform on a very granular level. And so that's anything that's on those kind of coding tab on GitHub is what we are considering coding activity. Now, what we consider project management is the issue tab. It's basically a board where issues can be brought up, and it's around troubleshooting, but it's also, other people can bring things up. You as a developer can bring things up, and you can assign other individuals to engage in this type of work. That's why we think about it as kind of managerial work. And so we are bunching everything that is happening in this space together as roughly what we consider project management. Now, how does generative AI come into play? Well, GitHub Copilot is a large language model with the purpose to assist programmers to code faster, solve problems more quickly, and learn code they previously didn't know. And was, as already mentioned, right, built by OpenAI and Microsoft and GitHub. So Microsoft also owns nowadays GitHub, just so that you get an extent of this whole environment, get an idea about the whole environment. So GitHub Copilot is a version, in a sense, of ChatGPT, and instead of next word prediction, you have next code prediction, or you have code completion, if you like. And so the programmers obtain a code snippet while they are coding. So let me show you how that works. So this is a send tweet Python file. Well, the developer writes a function header, and Copilot is doing the rest. So this is what it may look like in practice. So you can see there could be productivity gains here. Efficiency increases have been documented by others. So how Copilot, and so importantly, this is not just a chat, right? So this is a little bit different from the kind of ChatGPT environment. Now, in 2021, so-called technical preview was introduced. So this is a beta version that Dominik started with. And so people could already experience GitHub Copilot. But now in 2022, importantly, that's where we're going to start, is a general access version. You can get Copilot as a paid version. And there are a bunch of ways on how you can get it for free. One is the so-called top maintainer version for top developers. So now we're going to look at those individuals in particular, and we're tracing them first in our main sample over 1 year, extend in the dynamics over 2 years, and focus on our main outcomes of project management and coding. Now, The point of this top maintainer environment or eligibility channel really is from GitHub's side to reward open source software maintainers to provide benefits to the public good, and they wanted to provide them for free with this Gen AI coding tool, and they did that by creating a ranking of eligible projects, and that ranking, we used it to transfer it from the project level to the individual level. So now we got individuals that have free access to generative AI when they were below a certain threshold that GitHub arbitrarily defined, and the ones that were just above the cutoff, quasi-randomly, they didn't get access through this particular channel. So you can see this is, on average, maintainers just above and just below the threshold should be roughly similar. Now, this lends itself very neatly to what you may expect here, a regression discontinuity design. And one first question that you may have is, well, can I get this stuff for free? I want to go and be maybe I'm a ranked individual that is too high ranked. I need a low rank that's better, and just cross the threshold. Perfect, I'll get it for free. Well, people were at least thinking about how the ranking system works. And one question was, as a developer, what kind of open source project can you continue to use Copilot for free? So that was during the kind of beta version before general access. Question was raised. Well, what was the answer? GitHub Copilot is available for free as of right now to verified students and popular open source software projects. What GitHub defines as the popular open source project is sadly not expressly stated. So yeah, that's sad for the individuals. It's great for us as researchers because it's very challenging to actually know where you stand, and you also have to check whether you are eligible or not. So that leads to us using a standard RDD, a linear one. We do a bunch of robustness check and look at other versions as well, where our main outcome is the one of the outcomes is Copilot usage that we have as well, and the activity of those individuals. And then we look at whether you're just below the threshold or above the threshold, controlling for the interaction of ranking and the cutoff. So the main idea is the outcomes at the threshold are only changing due to a change in Gen AI. And GitHub Copilot was only assigned there, and nothing else happened at that threshold or at any of the rankings, actually. It was just created for this purpose. So we're quite confident that it's driven any kind of downstream outcomes by Gen AI. Now, we observe maintainers over time, and we create a measure of cumulative activity of coding, of project management, over a total cumulative activity. And then we have, that is the basically the open side of the data that you can get if you would just go on GitHub, and you could technically scrape that yourself. We have also proprietary data thanks to our collaboration on the AI usage, as well as the top maintainer ranking. Now, we created a balanced maintainer week panel. Those were around 180,000 developers, 6 million observations. And then we said, oh, well, let's throw it away. Let's go and narrow in only on around 7,000 developers and 270,000 observations, with the main purpose to narrow in to this small bandwidth close to the threshold, so that we can say something causally here, that we have a relatively good treatment versus control group kind of environment. Okay, so to show you just some initial statistics, I want to give you a sense of how much AI has been used here. This is Copilot. You see on the second line in particular, has AI ever being used? That's around 20% of individuals. So we're nowhere near at this time period of 100% or even 80% take up. And those are high skilled individuals here that may have a particular interest. Yeah, we can still say something causally, and I think especially initially at the innovation curve where we don't have that pickup yet, it's important. We have coding activities around 44%, what we call project management is around 24%, and crucially, so that we don't just talk about something that happens mechanically, we also have some other activities in our denominator. Now, this is, I would say, one of the most important graphs here. You can see Copilot AI usage in a bit across the developers' ranking on the x-axis. So think about roughly on the right side as the control group that doesn't get Gen AI access through this particular channel as the top developer. Well, what happens in blue, those people are using the coding AI GitHub Copilot, and that's because there are other channels, a free trial in particular, that's what they're using. Interestingly, when you cross from the right to the left, right at the cutoff, you see a substantial increase in Copilot usage. That's around a tripling in usage from getting free Copilot access. So we're quite confident that their downstream effects are driven by this increase in usage. Now, what happens with the coding core work of individuals and project management, what we can see is that coding, the percent of coding actually increase or core work of around 10%, and project management drops by around 20 to 25%, so substantially large changes. When we look into the dynamics, here you can see the relative share of coding, relative impact. We can see in the first 4 quarters the biggest effects, and then for coding they attenuate, but they still exist even after 2 years. We can see something very similar for project management. Here you can see this drop, and then for roughly 4 quarters, a little bit longer here, we can see this, those very strong negative effects. They attenuate after 2 years. Again, they still exist even then. Now, why is this happening, right? One of the main mechanisms that we have in mind is, well, Copilot reduces the cost of core work. Now, you can solve problems by yourself, so you don't need others to solve problems. And we try to think about how, can we get at that a little bit? And one idea is maybe to look into different ability types. I already mentioned, right, from the training data set, if it comes from high ability individuals, the code, then maybe low ability individuals have more to gain and could learn from that. And so here you can see a bunch of ability proxies. Max centrality is kind of how central you are to a project in terms of coding activity. We have the number of achievements that are on the platforms, as well as the number of followers and tenure of individuals. And you can see in orange here that the high ability individuals, when they are just across the cutoff, receive free access to the coding AI, that they are increasing their share of coding. Well, the low ability individuals do that even more. We see for the high ability individuals, they reduce the share of project management, and low ability individuals across the board do that even substantially more. So for us, that is some indication that there may be learning going on from low ability, from high ability individuals, and some transfer to the low ability individuals. Another idea, here I'm just showing you the rough idea, then I'm going to go into details, is what happens with the work of individual task. What you can see in blue is more independent work. For both coding and project management, we see an increase in independent work, while we actually can observe a drop in collaborative work. And work here is the tasks that we consider to be more independent or collaborative in nature. To give you a little bit more of a sense what that means, and now we really go into the lingo, we can see here the granular effects of our coding measure when we decompose it into what it actually contains. And we can see here at the bottom that the increase in coding when you receive GenAI is driven by new project creation, so creating repositories, and by push commit. So that's uploading code to the platform independently, which you can do as a developer. So this kind of independent work is driving the increase in coding activity. And there's actually a little bit of a drop as well hidden, which is when you create you can fork a repo, that's the second line. That means you can copy a project. And usually that's done with the intention to contribute to somebody else's project, to collaborate. And this contribution to somebody else is called a pull request. And you can see both of those measures, they actually go down. Those are collaborative tasks in essence. Similarly, for project management, we can see that at the bottom here, problems or issues that can be, for example, closed, and those developers are engaging a little bit more in those independent activities of closing or merging issues, while something like, you can see, assigning an issue to other people or requesting a review by someone else for an issue, those collaborative measures go down, and they drive the drop in project management. Now, if you don't like this kind of task-based classification, we also looked into how many other individuals are you potentially interacting with when you're working on different types of projects and based on different types of tasks. So what we can see that the number of collaborators drop for any of the coding activity other than creating a new project, which for that, by nature, that doesn't necessarily work. But for everything else, you can see a drop in the number of collaborators. Similarly, for project management, almost throughout the whole task spectrum, we can see that people, those developers, when they get GenAI access, they have less other developers around them to collaborate with. Now, I'm not going to go too much into detail of that, but we also looked into, on the project level, bug fixes relative to features requests, which we see are dropping. And we also have some rough idea about code quality. And at least what we can see is that it doesn't seem to be dropping because of GenAI. Now, aside from independent work, one part how independent work may happen is actually by people, experimenting a little bit more by themselves, and that's what we can see here. People that have GenAI access are just below the cutoff. They are exploring new projects substantially more, so they're creating more new projects. That's a 60% increase, and they are reducing a little bit their engagement in older projects. Now, we wanted to learn a little bit more about experimentation in terms of not just the new projects that you're engaging in, but also programming languages in particular. And here you can see a baseline. On average, a person interacts with around 9 languages here in the first row. And then you can see an increase of around 1.7 1.7 languages when generative AI becomes accessible. So people are exposing themselves more to new programming languages. And interestingly, when we weigh that by salary, we're using a Stack Overflow developer survey on what people earn that on average that are associated with those different types of languages. We find a small increase of 1.3%. If you take that in terms of dollar value, that's around $1,600 US dollars. And now we did a small exercise, obviously takes that with a grain of salt. When we look at those individual, we consider that a labor market potential here from GitHub Copilot. The price of GitHub Copilot is around $120 for a year. And so the net potential is around $1,500. If we take that across 300,000 developers that are all eligible, that's around $500 million US of value just being exposed from new languages. Of course, partial equilibrium. So that would be important to think about. So I have a bunch of robustness checks that I don't want to bore you with, but happy to talk about it. Minor highlights, we also engaged in a difference in discontinuity approach, propensity score matching, and we looked into another channel of students versus non-students with a difference in difference setup, and we find the same kind of effects for coding and project management. So this is quite robust result. So to summarize, we place emphasis on the nature of work instead of productivity. We find that generative AI changes work processes by increasing core work and reducing project management through independent experimentation. Impact is greater for lower ability individuals with treatment effects even after 2 years with a labor market potential of $500 million US. So what you can see here, generative AI can realign actual work with desired work. It can positively impact public good of open source software. And if you think about project management, this has the potential to flatten organizational hierarchies. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel. The paper is going to be discussed by Peter Gall from OECD. Peter, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the possibility for discussing this very interesting paper. Thanks for inviting us to be here. It's always a pleasure and to meet many familiar faces and meet new ones. So I really enjoyed reading the paper. It's a very interesting piece, and it really touches on an aspect of Gen AI that hasn't been looked at a lot, how it changes the nature of work, and the labor market implications are first order, as many of we have seen in the several sessions before. So just to get it pick up from where Manuel finished, a quick reminder of what I took away as the main conclusions and the main summary. So this really contributes to how AI shapes the task content of workers, and in the particular setting of how top coders change their task allocation when developing, maintaining open source code. So it contributes to a broader question by looking at a very narrowly defined but well-defined and nice identification to a narrow question. And the implications of how nature of work changes from AI, I think, are very interesting for 3 dimensions. It switches from project management to core activities. When focusing on a team aspect of it, it switches from collaborative type of work to autonomous work. And it also expands the nature of work that people are doing, less on exploitation, less repetitive. I guess it's another synonym for that. A more exploration, more innovative type of activities. And they also have this interesting result that it changes more within this top developer group, the low ability ones. It helps them a little more, and that resonates very well with other studies on Gen AI. For instance, the Bryn Jobson study in QJ, they also focus on this issue, and they find that indeed, for low ability workers, AI can help them more to catch up with the median level or the higher level. So this has broader implications for labor markets impacts of Gen AI. And to put this into a broader context, I wanted to just echo one of the sentences that the authors write, that we are in early stages. And it's true with a dynamic rise, but it's still early stages. When you look at the United States Census Bureau statistics on AI use in core business activities in the past 2 weeks, among all sectors of the economy, we are still at 5-6% in 2023, 24. It rises quite substantially over the past year or so by 50%, and it's true for many other countries as well. So we are at low levels when you look at core adoption, but it's rising very fast. And when you put it into context with previous general purpose technologies, which is a topic that has came up very much in the conference, also in the morning session by Jonathan, we see that AI can follow various paths. And when you think about the future impacts, it's important to try to take a stance how quickly AI will get rolled out, how quickly AI will get adopted. One GPT gives you a 23 adoption rate in 10 years time electricity. The later generations of GPTs, such as the internet and PC, were much faster, rolled out among businesses around 40% in 10 years time. Even later generation of digital tech, mobile phones, were 60% in 10 years time. So the question is how AI is going to be spread. Is it going to be faster or slower? That's a key question, I think, for the more broader aggregate gains. But this is, again, just to agree with the statement that it's very early stages. So the data that they use is very rich, even compared to this growing business of Gen AI identification. It complements very well these RCTs that are happening at the task level. But many of those studies actually work with samples that are orders of magnitude smaller, even in the coding environment. So a lot of studies have been quoted already today by Microsoft GitHub colleagues, but also by academics. There's a BIS study on coding, which all have sample sizes that are much smaller than yours, but the goals and the identification they use is somewhat similar. So, and you also have rare detail on the type of tasks that are being done, which is something that the other studies also miss. So the identification, I think Manuel explained very well and very clearly, and it's a very cool feature of the paper, and I really like the aspect that there's no room to manipulate your ranking because you're not aware of how the ranking is determined of those projects. I just had a question, but I think your panel setting addresses that, but I still raise it, is within those who may have access to the tool for free, so within those set of developers who are eligible, there could still be a variation that is correlated with innate ability. So those who are maybe more ambitious, more open to new things, they might be more with more likelihood to go and check out either whether they're eligible or not. So there can be some selection into the treatment. But I think your panel setting, I think, is controlling for this issue that more agile coders can seek this possibility with more likelihood. And related to the this treatment assignment, there is this focus on free usage of Copilot. So basically, you're focusing on those who have access for free. And in that context, I think it's interesting to look at the price of AI. It's how it evolves over time. I haven't looked specifically at the price of Copilot, but when we look in a recent work on the a large set of language models and coding type of models, AI models, and their quality-adjusted price evolution over time, we see that in these past 2 years, that is roughly corresponding to the sample period here, there has been a tremendous fall in the quality-adjusted prices by around roughly 80%. That's our ballpark number. And when you put it into perspective with other previous digital technologies, the ballpark fall is this similar high-paced, kind of very rapid declining quality-adjusted prices. So this is maybe something to take into account that might help you even with a broader identification, taking into account a broader set of the sample than you have currently, which focuses only on this free or non-free adoption kind of question, because there has been a substantial decline in the price for everybody else during this period. So you mentioned you're not looking at productivity, and I understand there's a lot of studies already out there, but I still wanted to highlight that in this area of coding, this is where the studies are mostly optimistic. So there have been a lot of talk about these studies before in various contexts, the business consultants and customer service and professional writing and all that. But coding has been looked at in various settings, and it stands out as having the largest micro gain at the task level, reaching sometimes 50% gains in productivity. So I think it would be a missed opportunity with this great data if you didn't try to look at this. So I would encourage you to think if there is some metric of productivity that you can take on board. And also, there is this issue that also Jonathan mentioned about the quality. So, and a lot of these studies are trying to look at quality, not only quantity measures. So I think you have some room to measure quality in some ways, and you could try to measure better the output side of the impact of Gen AI, either on the quantity or on the quality side. That would be really great, I think, because, again, your data set is much larger. It's a longer horizon that most other studies can follow, so that would be a great contribution if we find similar magnitude effects or not. And the other aspect that comes across very much in the business of aggregating these micro effects into the aggregate is adoption has many phases, basically. One adoption type is an ad hoc individual use. Some people use it in the firm. But we're suspecting that large-scale effects will come from large-scale, high-intensity adoption. So I wonder if you could maybe contribute to that question as well by checking whether high-intensity adoption has a disproportionately larger impact on some kind of output metrics than ad hoc, more randomized, more random adoption rate. And this is just a chart that Jonathan kindly already showed before, but I wanted to bring it back because here, of course, we are in ECB, so we're interested in aggregate effects. Productivity is a key component of potential output, and its long-term evolution is, of course, a key concern. And I just wanted to bring in one dimension to that comparison that people often look at when they're interested in productivity effects at the macro level. Is this similar to what has been happening with previous digital technologies in terms of the impact that we can expect? So when you look at some macro studies on the associated effect of ICT with US productivity in the mid-90s, the ICT boom period, the range is between 1 to 1.5 percentage points annually to labor productivity. That's the ICT contribution, that was numbers in the literature. Many of the estimates on AI fall are close to this range when the more optimistic assumptions are being met. So if you want to compare it to previous digital tech, such as the computers and the internet, I think it's hard to be more optimistic than those when you look at AI as impacts for the moment. So it kind of rules out these super hype optimistic scenarios in the current context, at least with the current AI capabilities. Let me give you some other more detailed comments on how you work with the framework and the variables and the theoretical setup that you had. So I think it's really useful how you define you define a bundle of activities and you postulate that individuals maximize their utility over these activities, the core and the project management one. And then AI's role is simply to reduce the price of the core activities. So it's going to be easier to carry out core activities. So my question is, can we think of AI in other contexts as something that helps project management type of activities, automate some of the project management type of things? I think we saw examples of that yesterday in another session where management was looked at very carefully and how AI can help management. So I wonder if in your framework you don't assume any improvement on the managerial type of activities, can we expect that the time of managerial activities decrease really? Because in many other contexts, you imagine management as a must-do thing. You can't really focus on something more if you don't do the management well, because it's a minimum that you have to do. So it's I was wondering if it's really you could move away from that approach when individuals can choose between core and managerial activities if you want to extend this to other contexts, to have an external validity of this. Because I think in many labor market contexts, managers just have a certain number of tasks that has to be done, and it's hard to reduce those type of tasks. The other one is you focused a lot about I really like that aspect, the individual versus the collaborative nature of work, because I think AI is really shifting those kind of aspects a lot. It basically helps knowledge sharing in a different way than before, and I think that's what you identify as well. There's less interaction about debugging and kind of giving feedback to each other because people just use the software, the AI software, for doing that. So given that a lot of the results, the main results, are driven by these type of shifts in the activities, so in the core activities you have more of opening a new project and more push and pull requests, and this is more relevant, I guess, to your own development, your own progress with the project, whereas the other types of activities that are related more as benefits to others, more widespread benefits, they are the ones that you classify as project management. So I think you can also look at your main results already as a way of shifting the use of your time to rely more on the activities that are beneficial to you. and less relying so much on the collaborative nature, exchanging with others, and learning from each other. So I think the main result already has a lot of this flavor. One could reinterpret them even in that manner, that it's maybe not so much core and project management, but also, or rather this thing of, is it collaborative to autonomous? And that raises a whole lot of questions about what's the role of AI in transmitting knowledge? Is it actually killing some channels of human-type interactions? Is it going to be beneficial or harmful for knowledge sharing? So that's a question that you could look at. Some further comments I put here are smaller, and we can talk about it in detail later. But it's really just the idea of you have a very nice narrow setting of open source software, which is a key part, and it's growing and it's very important. But I wonder if you could bring more examples, if you can think about more examples that can have some similar settings where the findings could be relevant, so that external validity could be even more emphasized. And then you have a discussion about why less project management may be needed with Gen AI tools. So AI helps instead of the humans help each other. But that discussion, I think, focuses on the demand side of what you want to do on these platforms. So if you go to these platforms, maybe you're going to use less, there's less demand for human interactions because you can just use GitHub Copilot. So I wonder if your results focus more on the supply side. The individual chooses, okay, how am I going to contribute to the platform? Because that's what your identification focuses on. So I wonder if the demand side behavior could also be looked at. Do you see some tendencies that indeed users, irrespective of where they stand in the ranking, when they start using Copilot, are they going to use less of this? Are they going to rely less on learning from others and interacting on the platform and more just carrying out their own activities? I think you have a lot of hypotheses. Maybe you could simplify those and put them into a summary table up front, perhaps, and relate more the regression table results to the regression equations. I wasn't sure I could have the right matching, but that's just smaller ones. Thank you very much for the great paper, and thanks again.
Thank you very much, Peter. So let's pick up some questions from the floor. Also, the colleagues online are invited to provide questions as well. Jonathan here, and here, second round as well.
Thanks very much. Jonathan Haskell, Imperial College. Thanks to the presenter, and thanks to Peter for very nice comments. Can I ask Manuel a little bit more about what you mean by management? Because this strikes me as being an interesting dimension of all of this. Of course, in economics, we don't really have a very good story about management because, as Milgrom and Roberts point out in their book, Economics, Organization, and Management, when we do production functions, we just assume that capital and labor are deployed optimally. And so there's no room for the sort of coordination type of effects of management. So can you say a little bit about when you say that people are reallocating their time towards more managerial type activities, can you say more about what those managerial activities are, to the extent are they kind of coordination, are they things like that, or are they somewhat removed from those broader types of activities? Thanks.
Thank you. Another question here.
Hi, Stephen Batiste, Inferred Mind. I'm actually quite worried that code reviews decrease with the use of AI, especially with Copilot. And I'm just wondering why this is the case. Is it people trust the AI more, or is it some other side effect of this?
Good. Manuel, you want to address the questions? Also, take time if you wish to address some of the issues raised by Peter.
Yeah, I'd like to address immediately. Thanks. So thank you very much for those questions. In terms of management, so we think about this as people are engaging in some projects, and on those projects they, they can engage in coding by themselves, but often they engage, especially for high, top projects, they do that with other people. And those other people are also top developers that have similar rights on the platform. And now, let's say another person comes in and asks, hey, this doesn't work the way I expect this project to work. Okay, so there's a problem that has been raised, maybe internally, externally, and now you can address that as a developer. Well, maybe you are not the specialist for this particular question, so you can refer to another individual, and you can assign another individual to then work on this question. Now, I think what's going on in this setup is that those questions are just not raised as much anymore because people already moved across the barrier using Gen AI. Of course, I cannot show that. I can show the parts that are happening with the behavior of individuals. But yeah, so that's kind of what we are thinking about when it comes to project management. So you're engaging on issues where you have to interact very closely with other people to figure out how do I solve them. And now with Gen AI, you don't need to do that anymore. Yeah. And in terms of reviewers dropping, I think it's similar in a sense. We think about that very similar, that it's not people reviewing less because they just don't want to review anymore. I think you still need to engage in the same type of reviewing activity if a code, like if a pull request is coming in and you have some new code, you still need to look at it if you want to integrate it. But people don't do that as much anymore because there is less of a need for it, because they are, again, similar to the same idea, they already overcame this kind of barrier of while they were coding directly in their interface. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Good. More questions? Here, Paloma.
So thank you very much for this paper. I mean, I thought it was a very interesting paper when I read it for the first time, because it really is so granular that really helps us understanding what are the channels through which Gen AI could impact productivity, which is at the end what we were discussing in this session. So I'm with Peter that we should think about some metrics that we could use in this paper. So different channels I'm seeing is just say that the coding activities is increasing, but I'm not sure whether this is by the same number of software developers, or is less number as we saw in the previous paper, that you need less people coding. So that would be an interesting way to look at productivity. The other thing, so there is, we said there is less collaborative work, and this, as Peter said, might be detrimental for productivity because there is less brainstorming, there is less knowledge transfer also for newcomers. So this is something that we normally don't think about, but might be also interesting. And there was another channel, just a minute, the experimentation channel. I think this is also very, very important, because experimentation is the way to get new innovations and to improve the quality. And normally the cost of experimentation is what does that we don't do it enough, above all in established organizations. So I think this is an interesting channel that we should also take into account when we think about the productivity impact. So if you could extend somehow the analysis of this amazing data set to think about this type of metrics and what it means for productivity of this type of firms, and then we can aggregate using the shares that Jonathan was talking about this morning, I think that would be a great contribution. Thanks.
Thank you, Paloma. Any other question here, over there, please?
Thank you. Katarzyna Budnik, European Central Bank. Thank you for both papers, and it will be a general comments to both papers. So when I was listening to it, I find it a pretty intuitive what you find in the results, how the things work, how artificial intelligence can help us to craft the code more efficiently. One question though, and it's this is what was just silently missing in both papers. So whereas I believe that we can craft code that does a task more efficiently and we can achieve it faster, the question is, what's the quality of this code? So, I mean, simple metrics would be how many lines of code do we need to achieve the task? Another metrics is how many references, how many basic operations are behind this code. And this is something which does matter. Maybe it's we have these cycles in IT, that once a software is a bottleneck, then a hardware is a bottleneck, and then the software is a bottleneck. Now we are obviously in the cycle, in a cycle where hardware is not a bottleneck. So we just can program however we want, whatever we want, it will execute. The question is like how long it will last, and then it's like when we will hit this already acknowledged bottleneck. So this is a very open question, and I'm fully aware that your contributions like expand on the different layer. But do you have any thoughts about this? How to measure this code quality? How this code quality can be hidden behind this AI progress? Thanks.
Thank you, Manuel. Any other question? Okay, last question here.
Thank you. Ivan Mikhailov, Capgemini Services for ECB. My question is quite simplistic. Could you please elaborate a bit more how you measure, define, distinguish between higher ability individuals and lower ability individuals? Thank you.
Very good. Manuel?
Yeah, maybe I'll address the last question first. So in terms of ability, you can think, I mean, this is very challenging to measure. And so really, we have a bunch of, that's why we looked at a bunch of ability proxies, really. I showed you achievements, the number of followers that you have, and maybe like how central are you to a particular project in terms of the code contributions that you make. But it's really the composition, I guess, like the relative share of coding and project management jointly, and not just, let's say, coding that makes up for a high-skilled individual. And so we can also think about the ranking that was created as a potential measure of ability, which in this case is, we narrow in very closely, and then we cannot use that particular measure anymore. But those 4 different proxies should give you a sense of their abilities. And what is kind of comforting for us is that when you look at the treatment effects, they're moving in similar directions across all of those measures. And I'm totally happy to think about more ability measures. And I think that goes jointly, and thanks, Peter, that goes jointly with some of the questions that were asked. Our ability is maybe, are people of different ability at different sides of the thresholds, or like is there some kind of sorting going on? And we have robustness checks in the paper where you can just see smoothness in the appendix of different kinds of ability measures so that we can rule at least that out. Yeah, thank you so much. In terms of craft, I guess that is a challenging one. In terms of code quality, which has also been brought up a few times, or quality measures, I guess, in particular. We didn't have that in the draft that I was circulating, but we right now revised, and we at least tried to say a little bit about quality. We haven't looked at lines of codes. We could. How to think about that is also very challenging. Of course, we could think maybe a drop in lines of code is helpful, but on the other hand, often measures of, like the value of proxies for the value is actually an increase in the lines of code. So yeah, it's a very challenging problem. I'm happy to think about it. But what we did was we looked at severity of issues that were reported, so security vulnerabilities. And we find that high security, very severe security vulnerabilities are actually dropping for projects that are providing AI access. And we see that, like feature request relative to bug fixes goes up. We can see that based on those ability proxies, when we look at the post period, people seem to become, their ability levels based on those proxies seem to increase as well, which makes us assuages us a little bit, plus some studies from that there is not much of a concern in terms of quality, plus some work on the GitHub side. I think they ran some experiments themselves where they didn't see at least drops in quality. Yeah, but very, very good point, thanks. And I think the last point, and actually, I think that was to both of us. Feel free to add.
I think you can answer the last question. I mean, in our setting, unfortunately, we can't look at code, these startups, right? But I think it's a very, very interesting question to look into. So please feel free to.
Sure. And I'm trying to think. The last one was, productivity metrics. Also, brought up prominently. Would love to do that. You have to know what the time is that people spend, and we don't know that. We can make some informed guesses when people upload code to the platform, how much time that would be on average, and we could then give at least a very rough back of the envelope, how that would impact productivity. But we have, of course, not highlighted that for a reason, because that's not really our strength, but we can look into that a little bit more. In terms of collaborations going down, definitely I think there is a potential issue here that I think if people are using with any technology, the more we are isolating ourselves, then we may not take into account ideas of others as much. And maybe when we're thinking about the firm perspective, maybe firms need to promote those. It becomes more of a rule role for the firm when you're introducing technology like Gen AI, that you're also thinking about how you can improve social interactions at the same time, maybe not through the technology, but maybe that's the actual task of a manager here. Thank you.
Okay, good. So this takes us to the end of the session. Let me join in this applause for these good papers.